Alright, here we are. Today is the start of a brand new mini-series going over the book Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky.
What a nightmare, huh?
Yeah, today we're going to be covering the first section, part 1, out of 6 parts. But I was thinking we could start at the introduction.
Let's do it.
I don't know if you have the same introduction in your copy as I do, but there was just one part in it where it was going over, at the age of 27, Dostoevsky himself, the author, had been arrested. His crime, meeting to discuss Western ideas and Western books. For months he languished in jail. Finally, 2 days before Christmas, he was led before a firing squad. Dostoevsky knew he had only minutes to live. Suddenly there came a reprieve. Banishment to Siberia, followed by service in the army, was to be the final sentence. The mock execution, merely part of the punishment. How cruel is that? You open a book just to read the introduction, and then it slams you with something as brutal as that.
It, I mean, especially nowadays, man, coming from the perspective of you can go to school, middle school, high school, you can get out, go to college, graduate with your bachelor's degree, and then have the aspiration to become an author. And so what do? You don't go to jail. You don't go to a war. You don't become broke and live on the street, getting kind of rubbing your shoulders with the elite of the hobos. What do? You go to a nice, clean, safe, air-conditioned college and earn an MFA in 2 years, where you get the privilege of writing a short story and reading it before a group of peers, and they read it back to you, and you get to discuss grand themes. Well, this guy, he got to look between two silver bars for a period of his life.
Yeah, just isolated, kept in
Isolated.
captivity, in Siberia of all places.
Yeah, I mean, what's the analog geography to Siberia and Canada?
You mean like the latitude, or
Well, in terms of if you were going to exile someone in Canada,
oh,
what's the worst place you could send them?
well, there's lots of uninhabited wilderness in the territories,
Mhm.
so you could just drop
Yeah.
someone off in the middle of nowhere with a helicopter. They wouldn't be able to make it to civilization if they walked for the rest of their short life.
I'm trying to think of any place in the U.S. that would be an analog to Siberia's geography. And the reason I think of that is I wonder if there are any writers in the United States who have, because Fyodor Dostoevsky is held up now as ironically enough, is held up now as a symbol of high Russian literature. I mean, he's almost a representative out of the grave of that country's art.
Yeah, like when
But
I
while
think
he's
of when I think of Russian literature, I think of two people, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy.
likewise, and I like to think of Tolstoy as the writer of culture with a capital C. Like he was all about the ballrooms, he was all about the war fronts, he was all about intimate drama in a family, but also broad, sweeping historical dramas of dynasties. And then you have Dostoevsky, who's all about, for lack of a better phrase, the individual drama. And I think that maybe one reason why Jordan Peterson today has latched onto him, because he's very much, in retrospect, he seems very much like a proto psychologist. If Shakespeare could be called a proto psychologist.
Yes. Like then you can just bring it back to the comparison to the Bible. I know we go here a lot. Like we didn't stray far from religion in our last conversation on meditations, but it's just so relevant. Like I kind of picture the apostles and the writers of the Bible stories, like the actual narrative, to be like incredible philosophers. They unlocked a new layer of philosophy that existed outside of just traditional talking about philosophy. They did it through narrative instead of just rules and explanations.
Yeah, so what do you think, what do you make of that narrative use of connection points as it relates to Dostoevsky, and particularly what you read, being thrown in jail? And he also, like, he would, I don't know if this is the same period in his life when he was in the work camps, or was that a different period?
I think the work camps were Siberia, wasn't it?
Yeah, okay. So also out of this book, we got Letters from the Dead. This is a narrative of Dostoevsky that he wrote almost immediately after leaving the camp, after leaving Siberia. And it put him on the map, the Russian map. That's called Letters from the Dead. And then a few short years later, he had his miracle 5 to 10 years, we'll say miracle decade, that included the Brothers Karamazov as his last work, and on its way to the Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, which this surprised me, man. I have a different translation than yours because the introduction that you read isn't in mine. But in my
Mine's a
introduction,
fairly new copy. My actual book was printed pretty recently.
is it by a Stanley something? The translation?
I'm not quite sure.
Okay, because my cover's got a sickle and hammer on the front. But anyway, at any rate, the original Crime and Punishment was a serialized set of short stories that appeared in the Russian Messenger.
Interesting.
And they were all sent out. I think there were roughly 6 or 10. I think there were 10 issues, serialized short stories that added up to Crime and Punishment in 1 year. So he was roughly writing. I have 6 sections in my book, and so do you. So it'd be like something like 2 or 3 chapters every 2 months. And this was also in a year where there was a lot of political turmoil and economic upheaval. There was a new czar in town, and he was doing a lot of quote unquote reformation that filtered down to the common folk. So people, as they were reading these stories in the Russian Messenger, which was a popular magazine, were looking around and seeing how people were losing their jobs, people were becoming desperate, people were drinking themselves to death. And I think that explains in part why the first chapter gives us the sense of utter doom and economic collapse. And our main character is a lost, drifting, lazy, spoiled student.
In a way, I could relate a lot to this guy.
Likewise, I saw a lot of connection points.
I
Well,
don't
what did you see?
I don't think a human can read this book and not see a bit of themselves in it, which is part of what I think makes Dostoevsky such a great author.
Yeah.
He's able to take that which is just the human experience and take it to the darkest places.
That is, and I think that is one of the qualities that separates great from good
I agree.
in a writer. I mean, if you look at that first chapter and the first 6, 4, however many there are in the first large section of book one, you find that he could almost have written about anything, and he almost does write about everything. And it doesn't matter in terms of the subject matter because he's using the subject as an excuse to show off his perceptive abilities.
Oh, you said that so well. 'Cause it's not
Like,
it's not
yeah.
the book, it's not what he's going through, it's how he's experiencing it that really
Like,
matters.
for example, it makes almost no sense for the main character in the beginning of the book to spend so much time outside the apartment on his way to the old lady's house. He's just looking around. He stops. He does a monologue of all things to himself. He goes in the old lady's room, does another monologue to himself. And if you say that to someone, they're like, oh, that must be kind of avant-garde experimental, and no human being does a monologue to themselves when they're walking down the street or when they're in an old lady's house and they don't want to be there, but they do want to be there because they want to take in all the details. But when in Dostoevsky's hands, the monologue doesn't feel like a monologue. It feels like what we do every day when we're alone in our thoughts.
Yeah, like
And it's,
we always
yeah,
monologue. We're just rambling with our own thoughts. Like when the voice in your head just doesn't shut up, it turns into a
exactly.
monologue.
And he captured that so well, the voice that doesn't shut up. I mean, it's incessant and it becomes compulsive reading, those long paragraphs of monologue. When if you were just to look at them sentence by sentence, it's almost meaningless. It doesn't belong on the page. You'd think the editor would have erased them. It's something like, no, oh no, could not have. No, that's silly. That's silly. But he strings them together so beautifully because it's so raw. It's authentically raw.
Yeah,
And
authentic.
now,
Authentic was the word that I was just gonna say, and then
yeah. And but the thing is, if you try to cook with his recipe nowadays, it'll come across as derivative. Oh, you're writing like Dostoevsky. Sometimes when I hear Jordan Peterson give a speech or talk in an interview, and he goes off, he really goes off and does one of his quintessential rants, full of intellectual ideas and sweeping generalizations, and it's eloquent. I can't help but, when I close my eyes, think of a Dostoevsky novel, particularly Crime and Punishment. So, in some ways, if I can trace back Jordan Peterson's style to Dostoevsky, it means that Jordan Peterson's trying to find his way out of the Dostoevsky maze. And once he does, I think he'll be on a new level in terms of his own artistry. Harold Bloom, a Yale professor, was famous for a book, Shakespeare, How He Invented the Human. That's its name. And in that book,
hmm.
this was put out in like the 80s or the 90s. In that huge book, it's about the thickness of infinite jest. He made the argument, after analyzing every single play of the Shakespearean corpus. That's why the book is so thick. It's full of analysis. But his main conclusion or thesis was Shakespeare went so deep into the human condition in his multi-variable portrayal of all these different characters. You have your Hamlet, you have your evil villains like Iago, you have your life affirming fat guys of wit, such as Falstaff, and the list goes on, Romeo and Juliet, teenage angst, that he just got there first before everybody else, that everybody else now, if they want free, unique, imaginative real estate in the minds and in the attention of future generations, they have to go beyond Shakespeare. They can't just repeat him. And so, because he was so grandiose in his imagination, most people in their writing career will spend the majority of it just getting to where Shakespeare got, let alone getting beyond him. And that poses a real problem for people that want to be imaginatively original.
Yeah. And what are the ways of getting to that point?
That's for the new creative artist to find out.
Yeah, that's something that to reach that new point can only happen once, right? And then it's just the standard.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And
That's
that's
what
the
happened with the
precise word
Bible.
for it too.
That's what happened with
Exactly,
the
man.
Bible. That's what happened with Shakespeare. That's what happened with, any other remarkable author or artist that has come along and changed the way we view literature, or art, or music.
Ooh, music too, exactly. Like Akira the Don. He uh
Yeah.
he took lo-fi, I would say, to a unique space because he combined lo-fi with the production value of a music video that incorporates something like a graphic novel's aesthetic with the
Yeah, like
bright color.
sometimes
Mm-hmm.
I watch these videos online that are just like anime music videos, but they're with like like comic strips. So I read a lot of comics and manga, so people edit videos so like it flashes like manga strips across the screen and has cool music in the background, and some people get really good production value out of those things.
Yes. So that's an example of blending the genre. And this is how we see something in high school people do, right? You read a book, your teacher gives you a sheet of paper, and on that sheet of paper you have the questions: what is the theme? What's the symbols? What do the symbols stand for? What are some great metaphors the author uses, etc. and on. What's the setting? Something like that. And it's all
Yeah,
very boring. It's all very boring and fill in the blanks until you have something like a Bloomian philosophy of what he called poetic influence.
it's almost like we're
She'll,
training people. It's almost like we're training people in school to fit within the archetypes that we know to limit them from going outside of it. But I really
yes,
think what we should be striving for is that new archetype, not just, oh, I read Game of Thrones, I love Game of Thrones and everything about Game of Thrones, I'm gonna make the new Game of Thrones.
exactly.
That's the opposite of what we should be going for. We should be going for that new idea and those new structures to put in place.
Because ironically, if you try to write the next Game of Thrones, you'll do nothing of the sort. Because the next Game of Thrones will look nothing like Game of Thrones. Because Game of Thrones looked nothing like the social realism of the past that it borrowed from, and nothing like the sci-fi fantasy that it borrowed from. It
Yeah.
represents a creative hybrid of the two.
And how many influences went into the creation of Game of Thrones? That's not just an egg that hatched in George R. R. Martin's head. That was his influence of reading Tolkien, of reading
Yes,
all the science fiction and writing all the science
Asimov,
fiction. Yeah, exactly.
Asimov in there. Also, we should not fail to mention he spent a good chunk of his life. This could be considered his Siberia moment in Martin's life, where he was in Hollywood and he was on the writing crew of a television series. In fact, multiple television series. That's why his ear for dialogue is so good.
Hmm.
So he brought the production value, have to write to the commercial attitude of a writer who works for television to long form epic fantasy. Now, that's a potent combination we have found because that allowed him to use the cliffhanger so deftly that once you finish Bran's short chapter, you can't wait to turn the page to find him again. But now you have to go through all these other characters and their POVs and their mini
Yeah.
stories. That's exactly what you get in the melodramas of daytime television. But he brought that sensibility to the large epic landscape. But he also brought to that large epic landscape a Tolstoyan sense of history. It's not that just he's naming magical systems, he's naming dynasties and lineage, and also borrowing from what really happened in global history. What was it called? The War of the Roses. So
Hmm.
yeah, he's bringing all these things to the fore, and like a good smith, knocking them together to build a sword.
Yes. And that's not to say that you shouldn't draw inspiration from Game of Thrones, because that's one of my main inspirations. But you need to diversify that, and you need to add in the Siberia aspect, let's call it.
Yeah, let's call it that. I like that because it's to piggyback off what you did with the Bible and introducing it to this conversation. Dostoevsky's Siberian moment, um, Martin's Siberia moment in Hollywood. These things parallel in real time Moses's Siberia moment in the wilderness before he returned to Egypt to free the slaves.
And again with Jesus when he confronted the devil in the desert.
Yes, fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. We could keep going. Charles Dickens, before he became famous, as a child, he had to go to a factory where he would make the leather for shoes. And this was a child subjected to child. There were no child labor laws then, so I mean, he was working 10 to 12 hours a day, um, tanning leather, coughing, breathing in the toxic fumes from the agents that were used to sterilize the leather, and then he'd be forced to walk home because there was nobody that would give him a ride. There were no cars around, to give his parents everything he had earned for that day so that they wouldn't starve. And he hated that. Walking to the factory, he hated time in the factory, and he hated walking home alone in the dark where anyone could pluck him up. So when he writes books like Great Expectations, and he has a main character that is a child who has hard knocks, we can't help but sympathize because the author sympathized so deeply. And that was a unique thing to do in his day and age, to make sympathetic child laborers, because everyone looked down to the child then. Now we look at it as, oh, of course you make a child sympathetic. Well, we think that way because Charles Dickens gave it to us to think that way. So these Siberia moments, I think they're part and parcel of what gives birth to the new real estate. Like Shakespeare, I mean, he didn't know that he was going to become the greatest playwright to ever wield a pen, a quill, a feather.
So much to the point where we don't even think it was the same person anymore.
Indeed, indeed. What happened to Shakespeare was he was sitting at Stratford-upon-Avon, not knowing what to do with his life. His dad was a glove maker, so he thought, you know what, I'll probably turn out to be a glove maker. He was very good at school. He just excelled his students at Latin and Greek, and that's pretty much where his education ended. Because what more are you going to teach the son of a glove maker except for Latin and Greek? And then, hey, yep, shoo, get on with your life, little boy. Go home.
Get some focus here. You got a job to do.
Get some focus here. And then this troupe of play actors roll into town, put on a play, and we don't know why, we don't know how, because we have none of the letters. But Shakespeare went with them to London. So something must have happened. They came, they performed. Shakespeare was in the audience. He fell in love with what he saw, this new form of entertainment, this new form of communication. And maybe he was a young, enterprising, brash man, or he wasn't so young, because back then being 21 was like being 31. And he went up to them and said, what can I do to be part of this? Well, I don't know, maybe you'll play one of the women. Or I can write one of your scenes. And then he showed them maybe one of his Latin translations from school, and they fell in love with his style, and they picked him up, they plucked him up, and they took him to London. And that began his career.
Yeah.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
I'm fascinated with the ideas of language. Like what learning a new language can do for the way you think.
Ah, yes.
One of the last books I read, that fantasy novel, Here There Be Dragons, there's like, the main character is like a extrapolation of Tolkien. Like the character represents Tolkien. And you can tell immediately because it drops so many obvious hints right away. It's just like as soon as something important happens, he's the one tasked with carrying the atlas of the entire like magical world of literature. It gets pretty complicated, so I don't want to explain the whole thing, but like he carries the atlas in the same way that Frodo would carry the ring, and he's learned all these languages the same way that Tolkien learned and studied languages and eventually came to create his own language. So that was a big structural part of that character of John in the book. And he was also a war veteran. So it really played really well together to make him represent Tolkien. But
yeah,
you can really tell that like language, like not just learning language to be able to translate it, but to be able to think in a different language, I think is something people like Tolkien was really into when he explored his writing.
I think one of the ways, and I mentioned this earlier, or alluded to it earlier, one of the ways a writer can trip on themselves in our generation is by taking the easy route to success. And I think one easy route to success, and I will define success for a novelist or a writer as breaking new imaginative ground. One easy, surefire way to fall flat on your face is to just blindly go to an MFA program where you think someone's going to give you the magic bullet, the silver lining to every page. Or if you decide not to go to school, to learn on the road, as it were, which I think is the better route, but it's not the perfect route because you can still fall flat on your face by making the mistake of, oh, what's the hot topic? What's the best subject matter? What are people just dying to read about? Then you go on Twitter and you see, oh, everybody's got a topic. Everybody's got a subject. Is it gender? Is it race? Is it nationality? Is it economic hardship? Is it a parallel universe? How eccentric do we want to be with our topoi, our plural for topic? That's a mistake because people don't go to the greats for subjects, and they don't go to the greats for polish, the polish that you can get in an MFA program. They go to the greats for innovation in language. Shakespeare gave us 10,000 new words. That's innovation in language. Tolkien gave us a separate code whereby we could generate a language, the elfin language. What Dostoevsky gave us, in part, is a reconceptualization of the novel. Because what did he do? And you can see this in the first chapter. It's almost as if he asked himself, okay, if I was to take a Shakespeare play and I was to put it in the spine of a book, what would it look like? Well, I would take a character who was self-aware and didn't want to be where he was. That's the Hamlet move. But instead of an Elsinore, I'm going to have just a place that people reading this book can relate to, namely Petersburg. And it's going to be crumbling and disintegrating like the state of Elsinore. And then what would I have this character who doesn't want to be here, the meta move, do? I'd have him talk to himself. Okay, so I do in a Shakespearean aside all the time. And then he added some other things into the mix. But that alone allowed him to break new ground because no one else was doing that. Pushkin wasn't doing it. Tolstoy doesn't do that. Nietzsche didn't do that. Nietzsche was doing something else.
Nietzsche was doing something no one else was doing.
Yeah, he was blending other things. But my point in all this is, it's not the innovation in subject material or variety of subjects or even length. Like Infinite Jest isn't good because it's long. And also, Hemingway's short stories aren't good because they're short. Ezra Pound's poetry isn't good because it's eclectic. These things are good because they represent innovations on the linguistic front.
Yes.
They dug a hole where people only saw cement. Like when people say of George R.R.'s books, Game of Thrones, it's so easy to read. It's like these people are real. They're paying him the respect of an innovator in language. They're not paying him the respect of some hack science fiction writer who turned to historical fiction. And I'm not saying any of that to make fun of anyone. I'm just using that as a hypothetical entity, a hack who just copies the genres.
There's a great quote by George R.R. Martin that it really goes deeper than what it kind of seems like on the surface. But he's like in an interview, and like this woman asks him, like, you've been credited with writing women so well and so beautifully. What's your secret? And he says, well, I've always thought of women to be people.
That's good. That's very deep.
Yeah, so like on the surface of that, it's like, well, yeah, obviously, you just treat a woman character like any other character. What's your secret to writing a character authentically? Think of it as an actual person. And that's something that kind of gets lost in that quote.
Indeed. And I would just annex to it that when you think of a person and you want to represent a person in literature, what you really have to do, maybe not consciously, but what you're actually achieving is a modification of syntax, of grammar, of words, and of word order that allows the emergence of a new idea. And the old Platonic sense of idea, because in the Greek, idea just means, literally, idea in the Greek comes from vision. It's where we get the Latin word video. So in many ways, the roots of video through the Latin is to the Greek vision. So ocularity, your eyes, what your eyes see, what is there. So that's why he riffs and puns off appearance. So Plato will say there's what your eyes see, and then there's the what your eyes really see. And what your eyes really see is the intellectual being of the tree over there. And the intellectual being of the tree over there is the form of the tree, that is the universal tree, that all these particular trees, as they appear to us right now, are the instantiations of. So too, when you say people, on one level, people around us and in literature that we can come up with are just instantiations of the universal people that are the formal outlines. And the only way to really get after and modify the people, a particular people of our time and place, is to take the journey once again up to the mountaintop and get another glimpse of the formal view, and then come down as fast as we can, as long as it's stuck in our memory, like a torch, and light as many different things with it as we can until that torch goes out and we have to make the trip or journey up again. So it's shamanistic in a way, but when he went to himself to ask himself, okay, now what would she do here? He was really asking himself, what formal length can I go in language to bring a woman to the reader's mind? And he achieved whatever he achieved to such an extent that we noticed, and therefore that lady's question. I'm sorry to harp on this, but it is so much about what you do on the page with the words on the line that counts.
Yeah. And how much baggage comes with every single word you could use
Truly.
in relation to any other word you could use after it.
Truly.
It's like a mathematical algorithm in a way.
Truly. They looked at Joyce's Ulysses, one of the most dense, complex, erratic, and elusive ALLUSIVE books of the 20th century, and they put it under scientific, probabilistic number theory. And I don't remember what program they used, but they wanted to look at it as an entity or structure. So they looked at things like keywords, frequency of repetition, overall structure of chapters, and those chapters structures in relation to other chapters to get like a meta structure. And when I'm saying structure, I mean like they would take literary theories like Freytag's pyramid, which is a theory of how you get dramatic tension in a block of text. And it looks like a triangle, and it has words in it like denouement and rising action and climax. And they put all these variables into the algorithm. And what spit out as an output was kind of amazing. You would think it would be very fractal-like and crazy looking, because when you read the book, it feels like one word produces 500 words, none of which you could have guessed. However, the structure that emerged was so particular and so fine-edged and so straight. It was like a snowflake that didn't break apart, but with all the edges on its side, like a jigsaw puzzle, found another snowflake that it connected to perfectly, which found another one that connected perfectly, and you eventually had this unbroken wall of geometries. Now, I don't know if Joyce was such a genius that he knew he was connecting all these dots at the beginning, but it doesn't matter. That would be the intentional fallacy to ascribe that kind of genius to him. His hand was just moving. He could barely see. He was wearing glasses. He was nearly blind. That's real. But the work itself, when you have an objective computer looking at it, reading it for its patterns, gave us something like an approximation to the Platonic forms. I don't remember what the article is where they wrote about this, but it blew me away. Most things that seem crazy deep down, are perfectly legitimate in a logical sense or a logical fashion.
Yeah, it just depends. It just depends what filter you're putting it all through.
Exactly.
What calculator you're using.
In some senses, it's as if everyone's trying to catch up to that computer's final decision by starting seminars on Joyce, right? Putting together different people, having them write dissertations on it, as if they're putting together this brain power to arrive at the same conclusion that this computer arrived at, namely that it is all held together wonderfully. We get a sense of this, right, when we think of the epic genre, or we think of J.R.R. Tolkien. We say to ourselves, here are 3 books, a trilogy, lots of writing, lots of teacups rattling, but also dragons pouring out fire. But it all is held together wonderfully. We accept that by virtue, and we call it the epic genre. Even books that are more complex in terms of line by line eccentricities can be wonderfully made. It's almost like that verse, I don't know, somewhere in the Bible, the human being is fearfully yet wonderfully made. Like Paul, when you read Paul's letters, I challenge you to do this sometime. Read Galatians out loud and read it as fast as you possibly can. As fast as you can. Read it as if you were running a sprint. And I think you'll just then start to catch up to the frenetic pacing of Galatians. I mean, it's crazy. He's going from one thought to the next. He's yelling at them. He's calling his enemies really bad names. Bad names. Like he's making dick jokes. He is. He's calling them the party of the uncircumcised. That's calling them bad dicks. I mean, it's terrible. It's really gross.
Wow.
Yeah. That's what circumcision was. It was taking off the foreskin of a penis. And to call them the party of the uncircumcised is like they would have gotten the joke. Like, really? But this is Paul. This is the forerunner of the Christian church.
That's like Donald Trump. It's like Donald Trump calling people Crooked Hillary and Crazy Bernie.
Surely, man. Because they're building up a narrative.
Ah.
But underneath all the name calling and yelling and the screaming and the jaundiced eyes, you get in Galatians a wonderfully made argument. And this argument just doesn't hate those people, it's love each other. Because there are so many one another's, each other's, one another's, each other's in that letter. Love one another. Don't take each other to court. Whatever's presented in front of you as a meal, eat it gladly because you belong to one another. So that's why that letter is held up, not because it's scandalous or full of scatological remarks. It holds up because it's wonderfully made.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, why else would you have celibate priests reading it to themselves and creating homilies before women and children from Galatians? It'd be like knitting together I'm sorry, I'm going too long on this. It'd be like knitting together all of Donald Trump's tweets, letting 200 years pass and then giving it to a very religious man or woman to read aloud very humbly to a crowd of 8-year-olds, 50-year-olds.
Dude, that just made me think, like, what if someone actually did that? What if there's a point in time where someone archives every single one of Donald Trump's tweets and puts them in a book and publishes it as the Gospel of Trump?
Hey man, it happened before. That's Mihill's maxim in psychology. The best predictor of future outcomes is to look at the past.
Yeah.
I mean, if we can have little troops online of the flying spaghetti monster cults, we could certainly have a Donald Trump syndicate.
Yeah, but the thing that makes the flying spaghetti monster so whatever it is that no one actually believes in the flying spaghetti monster. It's just a metaphor to say, hey, everyone else believes in the flying spaghetti monster except me.
I don't know, man. I bet there are some true believers out there.
Yeah, in the same way that there's believers in flat Earth.
Really, man?
Yeah.
Are you one of them? I'm not one of them.
No.
Can we ever really know?
I don't.
Maybe they're right. Maybe they're right.
I don't believe anything, really.
Ooh,
I
okay.
just I mean, like, there's things that I would subconsciously call a belief, but it's nothing that I can articulate into anything finite to say, like, this is what I believe, and as a structure of a part of my being I believe it. I don't have any core beliefs in any deity, or we didn't go to the moon, or we did go to the moon. I mean, I'm pretty sure we went to the moon, but I'm not going to say for sure if we went to the moon. Like, I don't think there's a hell, but I'm not going to say for sure that there is no hell.
Yeah.
After we die, in a way. Heaven and hell on earth is a different story.
I hope we return as information.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not that we return as information, but maybe we just leave behind the information. We live as vessels of the information, and we leave it behind when our body is gone.
Yeah. Yeah, there's probably something with the law of thermodynamics that doesn't allow us to have an infinite, eternal consciousness. Like a match, eventually that light, that blue flame goes out.
Well, maybe the world's just a giant brain. Maybe the universe is a brain. Like, I've heard different conceptualizations of, say, if you take the brain and you can fold it out, and it's just a sheet. Like, all those folds in your brain, you can dismantle it little bit by bit, fold by fold, and you can eventually lay it out as just a flat piece on a table. And I've also heard the same thing said about, the structure of the universe, or the observable universe, that if every one of these stars is a point of gravity, and you just removed all these points of, like, gravity and black holes and missing space, dark energy, all that stuff, then you could fold out the universe in a similar fashion. That would just be that the universe is flat. Like,
Mm.
I've heard scientists and astrophysicists say time after time that the universe is flat if you take away all the bends. So what if all those stars are really just a point where the brain is folding in on itself and trying to communicate with itself?
I like that idea. I like that.
Maybe I sound crazy, but these are the
No,
kinds of things I
you sound like
think about.
no, man, you sound like a good Greek pre-Socratic philosopher. There was a philosopher named Anaximander who proposed that the universe was mind. That's all it was.
Yes.
The word for that was nous. It was all nous. So when people speak of noology, Ology, they're not talking about know. They're talking about knowing. And the way to know the universe is to have the universe know you. And when you talked about the folds of space time and the aluminum foil crackling to build stars and galaxies, almost like Terence McKenna called it concrescence. When you get so much intelligence in one location, it resembles an object. So, like when you're making oatmeal and it doesn't altogether melt, you have some clumpy parts. You could look at that clumpy part as a concrescence of what oatmeal is. It's the densest part in the landscape of this melted oatmeal. It's the densest part of what oatmeal is, because there's more oatmeal in the volume and more oatmeal on the surface area of that clump than anywhere else in that bowl. So too, if you have like 100,000 human beings walking around, somewhere in that surface area, you're going to have a concrescence, a location of the most highly developed, complex essence of what it is to be a human. We could say one concrescence in the landscape of where people are is the city. The city is a concrescence. Urban areas are like melted oatmeal. There's oatmeal there. There are people there, but when you compare pure South Dakota, population 14,000, to New York City, millions of people. There's no comparison. Yet there is a comparison.
Yeah, it's all still oatmeal, but some of that oatmeal's a lot runnier than the other oatmeal.
Yeah.
It's completely different oatmeal. Might have some different flavor in there. It's not mixed as consistently.
So that's just my way of relating to on a terrestrial plane of maybe it is all mind, maybe it is all intelligence.
Like Marcus Aurelius would say.
Indeed. Which I think Jordan Peterson has to deal with this. Yeah, the individual is important, maybe even paramount, but you get these concrescences. Like, if you live in a city, you are not an individual. I'm going to say that.
Yeah,
Why are
but
you
I
not?
think
Why are you not an individual? Because you've got to take into account traffic. You got to take into account driving time. Otherwise, you'll be late for your job all the time. You got to take into account prices of food. You got to decide where you're going to live. You
I think that's where Jordan incorporates the node and the network articulation and the hierarchy of ideas. And
Go ahead. Go ahead.
like I'm maybe we just disagree on how we interpret Jordan Peterson's worldview, but
Okay.
I think he leans really heavily into the idea of hierarchies in everything. And I think that it's not that he doesn't acknowledge that like the shortcomings of the individual, but he just puts that on a pedestal above everything else. You have to focus on the individual before you start to network you as an individual into everything else around you.
Like, I agree with that, but I think it's a both and. And I'm not saying he's making it an either or, but I think it's a both and of the collective and the individual when you start to talk of the concrescence. Because, man, where does my happiness begin and the flourishing of a city end? Or let's not even use the word happiness. Let's talk about mental health, because you find a lot of mental unhealth in cities, right? People who are panicking, people who have toxic relationships, etc. And you don't know if it's the chicken or the egg, if cities just attract people with mental health problems or if people develop mental health problems because of the environment of the city. But if you want to solve mental health issues in a city, one way to not do it is to focus completely on one person, because mental health exhibits itself as differently as different people are. But if you think in terms of, okay, there's a better way we can do our streets. There's a better way we can handle traffic jams. There's a better way we can handle the architecture of these main streets so that the city starts to look beautiful again. That's something that doesn't involve taste, something more like collective spirit. But then the question is, how do you get after consensus? Oh, the city streets should look like this. The building should be zoned to this dimension. And not have that be driven by economic necessity, but have it be driven by a collective spirit. Like, you look at some of these cities in Rome, some of these cities in Europe, and you just, oh my God, what I would give to live here. It's so beautiful. You compare that to New York City and you look up, and break your neck trying to reach the top of the skyscraper, and you say, this is impressive, but it's not beautiful.
That's a good distinction. Like a sign of human accomplishment over nature's accomplishment.
Yeah. And I don't see, like, I don't know, hierarchies are important, but hierarchies build skyscrapers. Hierarchies don't build rainforests.
Yeah, you got a point there.
Like, again, I'm no field biologist and I'm not Jordan Peterson. I didn't do the psychological work that he has done. So I bend my knee where I bend my knee in both directions and I see to both experts. But and maybe JPB will do this with his next book, and I hope he does. Expand the hierarchy view to morphogenesis. Like, I really hope JPB tries to resurrect the spirit of Terence McKenna, because Terence McKenna had a lot of important things to say about ecological niches and how ecological niches can find themselves in harmonious arrangement with other niches without trying to dominate one or the other or find itself in a vertical relationship looking down to one of the other niches, but something like a circular relationship.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Like Terence
Yes.
McKenna is so good at articulating that, and he's dead though. And we need someone to take his place. And I think JPB is positioned with his clout and his public persona to do just that. The only question is, will he want to, and is he aware of the need? I'm surely, if he's read Jung, he's aware of Terence McKenna. The only
I
question is,
they've talked
does he
about
want
him.
to?
They've talked about Terence McKenna on Joe Rogan's podcast a couple times, I think,
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
together.
with JPB?
Yeah,
Oh,
Jordan.
I'll have to check that out. I'll check that out.
JBP.
Yeah, I'll check that out. Thank you.
I don't remember which podcast it was, but I think like Joe just mentions him in passing because, you know, he does it all the time. Hey, you ever done DMT? Hey, you know about Terence McKenna?
Joe, have you had a psychedelic experience, Rogan?
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to go back to the book a little bit and just talk about
Oh
the
yeah, what book?
oh, the one that we started trying to talk about.
Yeah, you had a couple questions, right?
Yeah, I took just a little note. I
Or
wanted
not
to
questions,
know.
but points that you want to make. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the letter that Raskolnikov's mother writes him, that
Yeah.
he reads in chapter 3. That was one of the parts in the book that made me just throw down the book and say, "Okay, we're done for the day." That that was a little bit too much, but like it sucks you in, man. Like you read a chapter from start to finish and you get out of it in a different place than where you started.
Indeed. So tell me about the letter. Tell me about your reaction to the letter.
Just like there's so much emotion packed in it. Oh, it's hard to articulate, but like he portrays this feeling of helplessness so perfectly, and it like the feeling of having your future decided for you in a way. Like when he's
Mm.
talking about like, oh, your sister's found a husband, but your husband's like you're never gonna get to meet him, and you're not gonna have a say in the matter. Oh, and we also had this idea that you could work for him and you could go see him here today or on this day, and he promised he would talk to you about it. And it keeps going on like that, and then just the one paragraph right at the end of the letter when he's just reacting, like his first reaction to it. Like, yeah, how
Do
else
you
do
have the
you
book in front
react?
of you?
Yeah,
Do you mind reading that paragraph for us?
sure. I have it bookmarked here. Almost from the first while he read the letter, Raskolnikov's face was wet with tears, but when he finished it, his face was pale and distorted, and bitter, wrathful and malignant smile was on his lips. He laid his head down on his threadbare pillow, and pondered a long time. His heart was beating violently, and his brain was in turmoil. At last he felt cramped and stifled in the yellow room that was more like a cupboard or a box. His eyes and his mind craved for space. He took up his hat and went out, this time without dread or meeting anyone. He had forgotten his dread. He turned in the direction of Vasilevsky Ostrov, walking along Vasilevsky Prospect as though hastening on some business. He walked as his habit was, without noticing his way, muttering and even speaking aloud to himself, and to the astonishment of the passers-by, many of them took him to be drunk.
Damn.
That's just a huge pile of emotion that you just can't sort through the first time you read through
No.
it.
Damn. That's concrescence.
Yeah.
That's literary concrescence. Like you'd be lucky in 5 books to find 5 different to find that in 5 segments across 5 different books. But here you have it in one paragraph. Mm. Mm.
Like even right now, I've read that passage at least 7 times, and I need to catch my breath.
Well, I mean, there's so many things one can do with it. I mean, we talk about school shooters. We talk about people that go off the deep end, hang themselves. We talk about people that wear masks and go and do crazy things. Like, I'm not saying this is the cause of it, but it feels as if we're given insight into what makes a person stop ticking normally. Like, Raskolnikov, I don't pronounce his name correctly, but he needs a new pair of batteries. I mean, he needs a worldview. He needs reorientation. But it's delicious reading this. It's delicious following him.
Yeah, it's even like therapeutic.
Yes, I don't want him to be saved, because if he was saved, then I wouldn't be. It's just, like you said, this beautiful form of therapy.
Yeah, that brings me to another point.
He's the suffering servant, so I don't have to be.
Yeah, that brings me to another point. This character is just so relatable, and you see how much he struggles, and yet you're rooting for him.
Yeah.
And you're rooting for the darkness inside of him, almost.
Yep.
Like, just to bring it to the last chapter in part 1, where he, is on his way to commit the crime.
Yes.
You're reading the whole thing, and he's talking about how he's gonna steal the axe, how he's gonna put the axe back, how he's gonna clean it, how he's gonna cover his tracks, and you're just sitting there like, dude, clean up after yourself. Get that axe clean, put it back. Please don't let there be anybody in your way of putting the axe back. Don't let him get caught. I want him to get away with this for some indescribable reason. I just want him to succeed in, like, the thing that he knows he shouldn't be doing.
It's a precursor to the Walter White mythology. Halfway, for me, not the last season, but midway through, season 3, season 4, I was rooting for Walt. More to the point, I was rooting for darkness.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. Partly because I had sympathy with his failures in life. Raskolnikov has a lot of failures in life. Also, I hate the environment that Walt found himself in. He just let a bunch of kids, a house he couldn't really afford, a job he didn't really want, sprout up around him and choke him like poison ivy. So too with our main character, Crime and Punishment. He's in a society that is crumbling economically, full of drunks, full of people that just can't stop talking about their ills, and an old lady that's trying to keep him down, keep him poor, trying to swindle him. Yeah, you want him to overcome the environment and fight dark fire with dark fire.
Yeah.
But it's so much more than that, like you pointed out. And I think part of that has to do with his Shakespearean quality. Hamlet doesn't belong in Elsinore. More to the point, Hamlet doesn't belong in the play called Hamlet. He's bigger than his play, and he knows that. And that's why we love him so. And we'll go back to Hamlet just to read Hamlet's lines. We'll go to the show just to hear how someone tries to pull off Hamlet.
Yeah, people make careers just rereading Hamlet's monologues. Like, what are the most iconic parts of any Shakespearean play? It's the monologues, and that's what people usually take from it.
Yes. So a bit of that is in Crime and Punishment with our main character. We want him to succeed because we understand that this is a archetypal character that doesn't belong in Crime and Punishment. He's larger than Crime and Punishment. All the people in Crime and Punishment, the old lady included, are foils to Raskolnikov's consciousness. Because we see, and part of the proof of his consciousness being larger in the book is we find ourselves in his consciousness. And I don't know how Dostoevsky did that, especially considering that he didn't do it as a novel. He did it as a serialized set of short stories involving the same character. It just astounds me.
Yeah. And I'm sure we're going to find a lot more to this book that's going to blow our minds.
To be sure. Well, my friend, what more do we have?
I think we've gone for a bit over an hour already.
We did a little philosophy, a little literary criticism, some deep appreciation, and linguistic theory. Thank you for your time.
Yes, very much so.
I'm going to be thinking all week about what you said in terms of language.
Yeah. There was one other little side note that I wanted to touch on. It
Yeah.
doesn't really have much to do with the book, but it sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole. So, like right after the chapter after the letter, when he's reflecting on everything that his mother had told him about his sister, he mentions the mother of Kazan, and I had never heard of the mother of Kazan. So he says, I know what you prayed about, dear sister, in front of the mother of Kazan. So I looked up what the mother of Kazan was, and it's a symbol in like the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic churches. Like it's an icon of the Mother Mary and baby Jesus, and it sent me down a huge rabbit hole of just researching icons in Christianity and Orthodox Christianity, and it gave me a few good ideas for my own writing project, because I'm
Oh,
trying to create my own cultures in a way, trying to develop a loose idea of what a religion might be to to a certain group of people. Trying to develop that as it goes along.
that's really, really interesting. A form of culture, a form of religion from scratch.
Yeah. I'm
Godspeed to you. Godspeed to your right hand.
I I've been trying to do it like 5 times over in a way too. Like
That's good.
I've
There are
been re-
five books in the Torah. That makes sense.
I've been researching the all the different world religions. I mean, I use the word research loosely because like even if I wasn't doing this for the purpose of, writing something in the future, I'd still be watching the same YouTube videos and reading the same articles, thinking about the same things. This is just all the kinds of things that really interest me, so I'm trying to work that into my theme as much as possible.
Well, be sure to let us know how it
Yeah.
develops along the way as these weeks go by and our podcast continues.
Yeah. I started this with the Republic. The idea kind of came to me in the different Hellenistic states, like Athens and Sparta, and all the rest, kind of interacting with each other. So I want to do something like that, but make it widely different belief systems. Like they wouldn't all just be Hellenistic. I wanted to make one a pagan faith, and then a monotheistic, and then some cults.
Indeed, you want some cults in there. That's where
I,
he
I'm
comes in.
I'm trying to
Um,
blend together like the Christian story and the Norse story.
oh, very nice.
Little things like that. Different
Yeah,
ideas.
you'll want Beowulf on your bookshelf.
Yes, I need to go buy myself some more literature. I've been,
And when you read Beowulf, you want to read it with your left eye being Christian and your right eye being pagan,
yeah,
because that's a pagan story, a pagan narrative, rewritten by a Christian poet.
that's kind of what I've been doing with, I've been reading the dialogues of Socrates. I've been reading this book Norse mythology by Neil Gaiman, who just
Yes.
has been recreating the Norse myths, or he recreated the Norse myths into a novel for the 21st century, and it's really good. I'd
Yeah,
recommend it.
you'll want to get some pantheism under your belt.
Yes.
And as far as the United States and its religion, I'll recommend to you your left eye is going to be reading Book of Mormon. You really want to look at that to get a
Hmm.
sense of what the United States did with religion.
I've seen
You
the
want to
South Park
get,
episode.
yeah, but you want to go to the actual Book of Mormon. You want to affiliate yourself with Native American mythology and Native American tribes,
Ah,
differences between those tribes, because that's where you get a richness of language and of animus, all spirits being in all matter. And then finally, to get the East Coast flavor of the US, your right eye is going to look at the secular. And the three people you want to look at is Henry David Thoreau,
okay.
particularly his book Walden.
I think I have an ebook of that actually.
Excellent. Because he's bringing to that lake and that rough individual experience all of Emerson. So he's the second person you want to read. Ralph Waldo Emerson, his essays, particularly Self-Reliance. Self-reliance is the soul of American transcendentalism. And then finally, the third person, Walt Whitman, in his Leaves of Grass.
These are all names. These are all names that I've heard but haven't done a deep dive into, except for Walden. I know about Walden.
Yeah, Walden, Self-Reliance, and Leaves of Grass. That'll give you a sense of, and then Book of Mormon, as far as what the U.S. has to offer. I don't know what Canada has to offer.
Canada offers everything. We don't.
Nice, man.
We don't have what would be considered a national religion here, really. We don't really have that much of a national identity other than, half French, half English, half everything else. Anybody else that wants to come into our country, just show up.
So in a fascinating way, if you think of yourself as a writer, and particularly if you want to subdivide it as a Canadian writer, it makes sense that you're doing this polytheological, polycultural gesture with your narrative.
And that's definitely another one of the things that made me pursue this idea, because I look around and I see like one part of the country is, French, formerly all Catholic, like the Acadians. Now they're just not. Like there was a flip, there's a switch that happened that people just stopped going to church in Quebec, and then that kind of echoed across the country. And then like on the West Coast, there's still a religious right, like a religious right wing kind of thing going on out there. It's kind of weird. Like in just Ontario, my province, you go to Toronto and there's different civilizations from all over the world living in Toronto.
So let this be a lesson to all our viewers and listeners out there. Look around where you are right now, and if you desire to write a book and or at the very least tell your own story, find in what's around you your authentic perception of it, and that will lead the way. It will inform you whether or not what you have in your head is a play, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a short story, or if it's a novel, or if it's a set of poems.
Yeah, don't be afraid to draw inspiration from anything.
Exactly. You don't have to move to California, New York City, Paris, London, Australia, Ontario to find inspiration. And this isn't a cliche. It's really behind your door.
Yeah.
You just have to be writer enough to see it.
Yeah.
All right.
Beautiful. That's a good way to end it. Everybody have fun, and we hope you'll join us again. If you want to check out Matt's YouTube channel, it'll be in the description. You want to check out our boy PatMan's blog, it'll be in the description. Yes,
PatMan.
Yeah. I really like that first blog that he wrote. Good book review. Book review. This is kind of different from a book review what we're doing, but I like that we're incorporating.
PatMan's very good. PatMan's very good at finding the relation of one book to the next. He's great at that intertextual stuff and patterns. That's a great blog. If anyone's looking for a book that they should read or trying to find a genre that fits them right now, I would recommend that blog post by PatMan.
Absolutely. All right, Matt, may the force be with you.
You too. You too.